Hello, I'm Gus Downing, publisher and editor of the D&D Daily, and this is the LP News Network. The Netflix docuseries Making a Murderer, now on its second season, has gained incredible traction and popularity among the average viewer binging on their latest favorite true crime series. This specific series highlighted the case of Brendan Dassey and the interrogation that led to a highly controversial confession and guilty verdict resulting in Brendan's incarceration. Worldwide leaders in non-confrontational interviewing techniques, Wicklander-Zulawski Associates, took a stand by highlighting the issues and errors made in these interrogations leading to coerced confessions, and have continued to use this case as an example in their training programs. This docuseries is one that directly impacts the practitioners, ranging from loss prevention to law enforcement. And with us today to discuss the impact this docuseries has had on the interrogation community and how it's helped push the evolution of the essential skill in our industry is Dave Thompson, CFI VP of Operations at Wicklander-Zulawski Associates. Dave, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Gus. Appreciate it.
You know, how did WZ get involved initially in this case?
I think, just like anybody else, I got stuck watching the Netflix series in about a day and a half over a weekend. They did a great job of keeping you intrigued to click on the next episode. But you know, after watching it, everybody at the office, all of our instructors watch and realize that if we're thought leaders in this industry, this is something we need to be involved in, specifically in Brendan's interrogation. So our involvement really started from watching the series, becoming educated on what happened. And these conferences, just like NRF, is networking, and had the chance at a conference to meet both Laura Nyrider and Steve Driesen, two of Brendan's attorneys. And through that interaction, kind of extended that relationship to the next step was writing an amicus brief, or co-authored an amicus brief to the federal court, 7th Circuit. And then again, on behalf of law enforcement and instructors to the Supreme Court of the United States more recently. So it's been a couple of years of involvement, starting from sitting on my couch watching the show like everybody else. Why was it important for WZ to contribute? I think, like I mentioned, we consider ourselves thought leaders in the industry of interview and interrogation. And if you're a thought leader and you're an expert and people look to you for your opinion, and if you look at what happened in specifically Brendan's interrogations, if you say nothing, that's just as good as saying it was done the right way. So I think it was the right thing to do for the integrity of just the industry, WZ, and as educators to say, hey, hold on a second, there was things done here that probably shouldn't be done in interviews and interrogations. We want to make sure people have a credible source on how to educate themselves on what to do right.
You know, there was so much discussion on the issues with the interrogation of Brendan Dassey. Could you summarize some of the key problems?
Yeah, I mean, you could read a couple of different amicus briefs, about 60, 70 pages, and go through all the legal jargon of what was wrong. But to really just highlight some of the key factors, I think number one is fact feeding or contamination of a confession. And there was a couple different specific incidents during Brendan's interrogation where there's evidence such as the victim reportedly being shot in the head before her body was allegedly burned. And that's a piece of evidence that nobody knows except for law enforcement. It's not released to the media, it's not released to anybody. So a simple strategy in the interrogation is you don't reveal that information. It allows you to make sure that the person giving you that information is the guilty person or somebody that at least had knowledge of the incident. And these investigators multiple times fact-fed and basically changed the course of Brendan's confession based off of their own statements, changing his story multiple times, giving bits and pieces of information to really fit his confession to their theory of the crime, which is the opposite way in which things should work. So fact-feeding or contamination, I would say, would be one key point. The second would be the suggestion or the appearance of leniency or a promise that, hey, you're going to be okay if you tell me the truth. And sometimes you hear things in an interview and interrogation that might border that line. You know, hey, Gus, if you cooperate with me, I think things are going to be okay. And that can be up for perception, but in this interrogation was even to the extreme of honesty will set you free. You know, I'm on your side, you're gonna be okay. And at the end of the day, you're talking to somebody about a violent rape and homicide. Obviously, being honest, if they're guilty, is not gonna set them free. Those two contributors were highly, I think, coercive, especially combined with the fact that Brendan, his age and his mental capacity were two things that I don't believe were considered by the investigators to the extent they should be. And the Seventh Circuit actually discussed coercion and how there's really a sliding scale of coercion. Something said to maybe you or I might be perceived differently than to a 16-year-old kid who's taken special education classes in school. So I think those are three of the highlight reel, I guess, of some of the inconsistencies we saw in those interviews.
Why is this important to the LP practitioner?
I think it's interesting that we watch the interrogations and LP, human resources, law enforcement. Our clients are across all these verticals, and we watch it. And every time we've shown this case, people think, "Well, I don't do anything like that. I would never say that." When, frankly, it happens a lot. Maybe not to that extreme, maybe not that egregious, but like I said, something talking about a suggestion of leniency or a promise. If I said to you, I'm talking to you about theft from a register. I said, Gus, hey, if you just tell me the truth, we don't have to contact any outside agency. Well, in essence, what I'm telling you is if you tell me, I'm not going to call the police, which is a threat or a promise. And so I think there's bits and pieces of what happened during these interrogations that on a different level or different scale happen in interviews all the time when there's no supervision, critique, and any kind of measuring or monitoring program in place for those cases.
What's your opinion on video recording of interrogations, such as Brendan's?
Yeah, I think, if you plain and simple, if that wasn't video recorded, we probably wouldn't even be talking about the case today. And WZ's been video recording all of their interrogations since 1982, and we're an advocate for that. There's a lot of obstacles that businesses may have financially or different issues from consent state to state. I understand all of that, but at the end of the day, from a transparency perspective of making sure we know what's going on in the interview room, I think recording is essential to that. And really from a practitioner perspective, there's a lot of arguments out there that people go into an interrogation solely focused on getting a confession, which is the wrong way to go about an interview. If it's video recorded, it actually, I think, helps benefit the practitioner, the interviewer, because if I interview you and you lie to me 30 times in an hour interview and none of it's recorded, nobody knows this give and take. If it's recorded and you lock yourself into an alibi or a story, even if you never confess, but I can prove your alibi wrong with other tangible evidence, the confession's not as important, which then changes the scope of what do I need to go after in that interview. So I think video recording has a ton of benefits on both sides of the fence.
How long did the interview last, Brendan?
Brendan, it's, there's multiple different interviews. One was not recorded at all. And so back to your last question, who knows what occurred during that conversation, what information was given up. One was audio recorded, and then there are two more video recorded, and those two, one's about 3 to 4 hours or so. And you bring up that point of how long the interview was.
Right.
A lot of people think for an interview to be coercive, for this to be a false confession, there must have been abuse, they must have withheld food and water, and that's not what coercive always means. Brendan's sitting on a couch for one of these when the confession actually occurs. Looks comfortable, but comfortable and talking nice doesn't mean it's not coercive, right? The psychological impact of the words that we say can be just as coercive as a physical threat.
If you were to look at the coercion and say it was, I hate to ask this, but if it was severe, moderate, taking into consideration just Brendan and his mental state, and obviously being somewhat, I don't know what his diagnosis is, but and I don't know the proper phrase to use here. I'm struggling with it. But what would you say their approach was? Was it a severe coercion? Was it truly abuse on the part of the investigators?
Yeah, I think the word choice is it's difficult to determine. From a coercion standpoint, it's always hard to measure because each person perceives things differently. In my opinion, this was extremely coercive. Multiple times first of all, when there's the lack of evidence, you have to think about the context of the interview. So there's a lack of physical evidence that really points to Brendan as the guilty suspect. And because of that, the little bit of circumstantial evidence that the investigators have, the coerciveness starts with making sure they tell the subject how much they know the truth. They know what happened. Frazier versus Cupp is a Supreme Court law that allows investigators to lie during the interrogation. It's the false evidence ploy. But just because you're legally allowed to do it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing to do. And so what happens is when a subject is told multiple times, we know you're lying to us, we actually know what happened. And by the way, just tell us the truth and everything's going to be okay. In one sentence, probably not enough to get somebody to confess, but multiple times over and over again over the course of multiple interviews, especially with a subject like Brendan who's more vulnerable than most, I think that if there's a scale of coercion, that would be on the high end.
Well, they even said, he was asking the question throughout, I get to go home, or I get this over and you get to go home, or something of that nature. I mean, that was...
I think that's...
I got to get my homework done for tomorrow was one comment I heard.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that we hear that because, you know, if you listen to a lot of the academics that work on behalf of wrongfully convicted people, is you hear that the suspect or the subject, the defendant, never thought, you know, that there was actually going to be consequences for their actions. And to the common person looking on the outside, you'd think, this person just admits to a violent crime, rape, homicide. Of course they know there's consequences. And you never really know how they feel, but Brendan gives us that insight as multiple times during his interview, he asks questions, you know, can I call my girlfriend? Am I going to be able to get back to, you know, sixth period? More worried about getting back to school after he just allegedly confesses to a homicide and a rape. And then on the same note, as soon as the investigators leave the room, and Brendan's mom enters the room, he immediately recants his confession.
Right.
Immediately starts to look for some kind of support mechanism there. And I think all that tells us a lot about his state of mind at the time.
And these investigators were trained. I mean, they were also trained to do this, so to speak. I mean, certainly they could have gone way beyond the training methods, but they were in fact trained. Yeah,
and I think what's interesting is a lot of investigators are trained in a variety of different methods, but it's what happens after the training. And most law enforcement are great individuals that have one of the most difficult jobs, is sitting across from somebody who committed some violent crime and try to get them to tell you the truth. That's a near impossible feat. But they have a lot of pressure from you know, prosecution, from a victim's family, from whoever else, to make sure that we can get to the truth. So sometimes the training that's done over 2 or 3 days, maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, and practitioners develop their own bad habits. You know, I conduct an interview and this worked, so I'm going to do this again. And when there's a lack of transparency, recording, a lack of feedback from supervisors, or even a lack of challenges from the defense side of the table, there's no need to change. And that's really, you know, us having this session and just discussing this case is to try to advocate change, is we need to be aware of what's being said in these rooms so that we don't run into another incident like this.
So what should companies and agencies learn from this?
Yeah, I think one that we just talked about, going to a training seminar is not enough.
Right.
You know, and obviously as a trainer, you hope that you're giving as much information as you can in a training session, but it's what are you doing after 2 or 3 days? What are you doing with your in-service, your seasoned folks, whether it's in an agency, in-service detectives, or it's in the retail world, the 10, 15, 20-year loss prevention veteran, the professional, that hasn't been through training in 10 or 15 years. When's the last time they've been there? So one is training and reinforcement. And number two is really the feedback that somebody gets from their boss after an interview. I think that frontline conversation, and I remember from my years of being in the field, is you call up your boss after an interview and the first question was, hey, did you get it? You know, to the confession. And the next question was, well, how much did you get? And I think that still happens, and it's an exciting thing for people to talk about. What I'd like to do is try to change that question, that if they got it relating to the confession, the question should be, how did you get it? What caused this person to confess? Because rarely is somebody going to walk into an interview room and voluntarily say, you're right, I'm guilty of all these crimes, which means the interviewer did something in that conversation to get that person to tell them the truth. I would want to know, if I'm a supervisor, whether I'm mid-level or I'm the vice president of LP or I'm legal counsel, I want to know, what did that interviewer say that gave that subject the opportunity to confess? And I think that would give us a lot of insight as to what's happening in those interview rooms.
Yeah, it certainly would. You know, how has this case impacted the training that is delivered in your seminars?
Yeah, I think
WZs, I should say.
Yeah, WZ and hopefully even other companies and training agencies. I think one of the biggest focuses is we actually use Brendan's case in our criminal program. We teach law enforcement. We now spend about a half a day just talking about false confessions. And we always talked about it, but now it's a real dedicated section of the program. We use Brendan's case as an example because it's not physical coercion.
Right.
It's what's the psychological impact. So that's one major change. From a behavior standpoint, there's a lot of issues in that, I believe, in Brendan's case of misclassifying his behavior. Meaning, if you just went to a program, and a lot of people go to a training program and they leave and they feel like they're a human lie detector. And that doesn't exist. And so what happens is now you interview somebody and you have a little bit of evidence that makes them feel kind of guilty, and now you interview someone and they have this itch on their face and they look up and they look to the right. And now based off of whatever your perceptions of your training, the level of evidence that you have, that just confirms in your head guilty. They look guilty, everything else is guilty, and they're guilty. So we've always talked about behavior in our programs, but the way we've really focused it now is getting away from any type of detection or deception detection or truth versus lie, is more on the knowledge that you could have somebody that's in your room, that's in your interview room, showing you all these nervous behaviors because they're nervous. It could be because they're innocent and they don't think you believe them. It could be because they're guilty. It could be because they have an itch on their face. So using behavior just as a common means to understand a conversation, but not to classify as truthful or as deceptive has been a huge part of our program. And really focusing on, lastly, investigating the confession. Is an interview, an investigation should never end with, I did it. If you get the I did it, it should then be, well, let's investigate to make sure the way they said it, they did it, is accurate. There's evidence that we can prove or disprove that confession. It should never end with the I did it.
What other issues may come from this in regards to like legislation?
Yeah, I think recording of interrogations, I hope this has brought a highlight to the importance of that. Last time I checked, I think we're at 25 states, domestic in the US, that have mandates on interrogating felony level cases. There's a lot of now mandates on juveniles having recorded interrogations. There's some other legislation out there trying to ensure that juveniles have a higher level, I would say, of Miranda, if you think about that, is making sure that either they have an attorney immediately, that they're not allowed to waive Miranda by themselves, or that you at a minimum have to provide Miranda in a different way in the law enforcement setting. So there's some legislative settings or legislative discussion around the context of a conversation. From a legal standpoint, and this is not my expertise, but there's a lot of discussion about the appeal process that Brendan's going through, that this should be an easier process. Easier might be the wrong word, but it should be more targeted for these types of cases. There's some laws out there that prevent some of these appeals getting to the Supreme Court for a variety of reasons. But from a strategy standpoint, I mentioned Frazier versus Cupp, which is the false evidence ploy, lying during the interrogation. That's been a hot topic the last several years. A lot of other countries have gone to removing that, and so that's something that who knows, that's up for debate. And there's a lot of studies right now as well on what they call minimization techniques. So one of the issues with Brendan is the appearance that there might be no consequences. So there's a lot of research out there trying to determine, if somebody did something because of financial issues, they stole money from a register because they got in a car accident, they need to pay their bill. If they're able to rationalize that, does that really take away any consequences versus somebody took money because their boss told them they were allowed to, don't worry about it, or maybe you were drunk and you don't remember doing it, you passed out. And those types of rationalizations or themes might remove intent or consequences. So I think what's to come is probably continued clarification as to what's the right way to do this, because we want to make sure we provide practitioners with a guide to get to the truth while mitigating the risk of a false confession.
Are there any other resources for the viewers to learn more about Brendan's case and the impact it's had on the industry?
Yeah, I know, obviously WZ, we host a lot of information on our website, so that's an easy place to go, just w-z.com. And then we have a whole landing page, Identify the Truth. So if you go to wz.com/truth, we have the two amicus briefs that we were a part of. There's an article in the New Yorker about this case that we got interviewed for. So there's a lot of good resources on our page. But I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the work done by the Center on Wrongful Conviction of Youth out of Northwestern University. And I mentioned Steve and Laura earlier. And they've really been Brendan's strongest advocates throughout this entire process, and there's a lot of good information through the Bloom Legal Clinic out of Northwestern, and a lot of good work that they're doing as well. If people want to learn more about the case and more globally, wrongfully convicted youth.
How do you think Brendan's case is going to work out? I mean, what's your prediction there, and why the stumbling block of? I mean, there was one moment that it came out, I think they came out public that he was going to be released. I mean, one court released him, and then all of a sudden that stopped.
Yeah, and it was the timing of that was actually right around NRF Protect during that.
Yeah,
that
and it was
year.
like he had 2 days, and he was going to be out at the end of the week or something like that.
Yeah, and if you think about how for the viewers out there that have watched Netflix, we were all excited. Now imagine the emotion of Brendan and the family, right? When what had happened, and kind of a short story there is, the case got appealed from Wisconsin, the state Supreme Court, up to the 7th Circuit Federal Court, and it was a vote of 3 different judges, and we won that decision 2 to 1, which was exciting, right? They ruled that the state court essentially did not apply the law correctly, meaning they didn't look at Brendan as a vulnerable subject. They almost eliminated that from their decision. So the federal court was able to say, your original ruling was wrong, because you didn't take that into consideration. So it was an exciting moment for everybody, obviously for Brendan, his family, and his attorneys. And they tried to get an immediate release for Brendan. The state appealed that. And I can understand if the case gets flipped again, which it did, it's a difficult thing to release somebody and bring him back in. So the case gets appealed again to the entire panel of judges, so 9 judges, and then the case got flipped again. So the next level from there was to try to appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Supreme Court can pick if it hears a case or not. Several factors, one of which it has to be a case that affects globally, right, nationally. It can't just be a one-off case. And so Brendan's attorneys did a great job of advocating for that. There were several amicus briefs written by everything from the American Psychological Association. Ours was the law enforcement and practitioners, and a lot of support on Brendan's behalf, and the Supreme Court denied hearing the case. So the options continue to get limited, but that does not limit the amount of effort being put into Brendan's case, for sure. So one of the focuses now is on his uncle, Steve Avery, which is really a separate topic, but on his case, the possibility of new evidence with his attorney, Kathleen Zellner, being involved, new evidence or contradictory evidence, or a potential Denny suspect, which would be somebody else that could have committed the crime. And all of those things could have a domino effect into Brendan's case. So we'll just kind of wait and see for now.
Yeah. Well, Dave, I want to thank you for taking the time today.
Great. Thanks, Gus. Appreciate it.
Well, that's it for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to thank you for watching. And until next time, let's keep them all safe out there.